Commander Sarah Chen stood at the observation deck of the human diplomatic vessel New Horizon, watching the crystalline spires of Zephyr Prime grow larger through the transparent aluminum viewport. The planet below looked like someone had carved it from pure diamond and set it spinning in the void. Towers of living crystal reached toward the sky, their surfaces catching and refracting the light of the system's twin suns into spectacular rainbows that danced across the atmosphere. This was humanity's first chance to join the Galactic Concord, the ancient alliance of civilized species that governed most of known space. For 300 years, humans had been exploring the galaxy alone, building colonies on distant worlds and making contact with dozens of alien races. But none of those encounters had led to formal recognition as a sapient civilization. The Zephyrians were different. They were one of the founding members of the Concord, and their recommendation carried enormous weight. Sarah adjusted her formal diplomatic uniform and checked her appearance in the polished metal surface of the bulkhead. At 42, she had spent most of her adult life in space, negotiating trade agreements and first contact protocols with alien species. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her brown eyes showed the steady confidence that had made her Earth's top diplomatic officer. But today she felt the weight of her species' future resting on her shoulders. The shuttle bay doors opened with a soft hiss, and Sarah walked through the corridors of her ship one last time before the mission began. Her team of 12 diplomats, linguists, and cultural specialists were already waiting in the shuttle. They had studied everything known about Zephyrian society for months, learning their complex musical language and understanding their deep respect for harmony and balance. The Zephyrians were unlike any species humanity had encountered. They stood, nearly 8 feet tall, with bodies that seemed to be carved from living crystal. Their skin was translucent, showing the soft inner light that pulsed through their forms like a gentle heartbeat. They had no vocal cords as humans understood them. Instead, they communicated through harmonic resonance, creating complex musical patterns that could convey not just words but emotions, memories, and abstract concepts. More importantly, the Zephyrians were telepaths, not the mind-reading kind from human fiction, but beings who could sense the emotional and mental states of others nearby. They had evolved this ability over millions of years, creating a society based on perfect understanding and cooperation. There had never been a war on Zephyr Prime. There was no crime, no conflict, no misunderstanding that could not be resolved through their shared consciousness. The shuttle descended through the planet's atmosphere, and Sarah watched the alien landscape unfold below them. The cities were works of art, with crystalline buildings that seemed to grow organically from the ground. Gardens of exotic plants with leaves like colored glass stretched between the structures. Rivers of pure silver water wound through it all, reflecting the dancing lights from the crystal spires. They landed in the central plaza of the capital city, where a delegation of Zephyrians waited to greet them. The beings moved with a grace that made them seem to float rather than walk. Their leader stepped forward, and Sarah heard the musical tones of their greeting translated through her communication device. Welcome, beings of distant Earth. I am Council Leader Meridian of the First Harmony. We have prepared a place for you in our city while we consider your request to join our alliance. Sarah bowed respectfully, as her cultural briefings had instructed. Thank you, Council Leader. We are honored by your hospitality and grateful for this opportunity to prove that humanity deserves a place among the civilized species of the galaxy. The next 7 days passed in a whirlwind of formal ceremonies, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic meetings. Sarah and her team were housed in a beautiful crystal palace that had been specifically grown for their visit. The walls were transparent, offering stunning views of the alien city, and the furniture seemed to shape itself to accommodate human physiology. The formal negotiations took place in the Great Harmony Chamber, a massive crystalline dome where the Zephyrian Council gathered. Sarah presented humanity's achievements in science, art, and philosophy. She spoke of Earth's diverse cultures, their music and literature, their struggles to overcome conflict and build a better society. The Zephyrians listened with polite attention, their inner light pulsing in complex patterns that Sarah's translator could only partially interpret. But throughout the meetings, Sarah noticed one Zephyrian who seemed different from the others. Her name was Lyralith, and she served as the council's cultural observer. While the other Zephyrians maintained the formal distance typical of their species, Lyralith appeared genuinely curious about the human delegation. She asked questions about human emotions, human creativity, and human individuality that went beyond the standard diplomatic protocols. During one evening reception, Lyralith approached Sarah privately. Through the musical tones of her language, she asked about human art and why humans created so many different styles and forms of expression. Sarah tried to explain the concept of individual artistic vision, but she could see that Lyralith struggled to understand how beings could have such different perspectives on beauty and meaning. The days passed quickly, filled with tours of Zephyrian cities, demonstrations of their crystal-growing technology, and shared meals of exotic foods that tasted like music given physical form. Sarah's team worked hard to present humanity in the best possible light, but she sensed an underlying current of skepticism from many of the council members. The Zephyrians had dealt with hundreds of species seeking membership in the Conquered. Most were rejected not for lack of intelligence or technology, but for failure to demonstrate the kind of peaceful, harmonious society that the Conquered required. Species that were prone to internal conflict, that could not resolve their differences through understanding and cooperation, were considered too dangerous to be given access to advanced galactic technology and trade networks. Sarah knew that humanity's history was full of wars, conflicts, and misunderstandings, but she also believed that humans had learned from their mistakes, that they had developed the wisdom and maturity to take their place among the stars as peaceful neighbors and trading partners. On the final day of the diplomatic mission, the Council announced that they would need more time to consider humanity's application. This was not unexpected, as Sarah knew that such decisions could take years or even decades. But she hoped that the personal connections her team had made, especially with Lyralith, would work in their favor. As Sarah prepared to leave the Crystal Palace and return to her ship, she felt cautiously optimistic. The meetings had gone well, and she believed that she had successfully demonstrated humanity's potential as a peaceful and cooperative species. Her team was already packing their belongings and preparing for the journey back to Earth, where they would report their progress to the Global Council. Sarah took one last look at the alien city from her room in the Crystal Palace. The twin suns were setting, casting the crystalline spires in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful beyond anything Earth had to offer, and she hoped that someday humans would be welcome to visit such places as friends and allies, rather than supplicants seeking approval. She gathered her personal belongings and walked through the corridors of the palace toward the shuttle bay where her team was waiting. The mission was complete, and now there was nothing to do but wait for the Zephyrians to make their decision about humanity's future in the galaxy. Sarah reached the entrance to the shuttle bay and paused to take one final breath of the sweet, crystalline air of Zephyr Prime. That was when she heard the musical tones behind her, translated by her communication device into words that made her blood run cold. "Commander Chen, may I ask you something before you leave?" Sarah turned to see Lyralith standing in the corridor, her crystalline form pulsing with an inner light that seemed somehow different than before. There was something in the Zephyrian's posture, something in the harmonic patterns of her communication, that filled Sarah with a sudden, inexplicable dread. Her heart began to race as she realized that this innocent question might be the most important moment of the entire diplomatic mission. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned to face Lyralith. The Zephyrian's crystalline form stood perfectly still in the corridor, but her inner light was pulsing in rapid, irregular patterns that Sarah had never seen before. Something was very wrong, but Sarah forced herself to maintain her diplomatic composure. "Of course, Lyralith. What would you like to know?" Sarah replied, though every instinct was telling her to run toward the shuttle bay and get off this planet as quickly as possible. Lyralith moved closer, her movements more hesitant than the usual flowing grace of her species. When she spoke, the musical tones were quieter than normal, almost whispered. Sarah's translator worked to convert the complex harmonics into human speech, but even the mechanical voice seemed to carry an undertone of fear. Commander Chen, why? Do your people sing to themselves when they believe no one is listening? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what Lyrillith meant. Humans didn't sing to themselves, at least not in any way that would be noticeable to aliens during formal diplomatic meetings. Sarah had been careful to follow all protocols, to present humanity in the most professional manner possible. I'm not sure I understand your question, Sarah said carefully. Can you explain what you mean by singing to ourselves? Lyrillith's light patterns shifted to what Sarah had learned indicated deep distress among the Zephyrians. The alien being seemed to struggle with how to explain something that clearly troubled her greatly. Your species, when you are alone, when you think others cannot perceive you, there is always music in your minds, not the harmonious songs of communication, but chaotic melodies that never stop. Each of you carries on constant conversations with invisible companions. We can sense these sounds, but we cannot understand them. They frighten us. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she began to understand. The Zephyrians were telepaths who could sense emotional and mental states. What they were picking up, On wasn't singing at all. It was something far more fundamental to human consciousness. Something so basic that Sarah had never even considered it might be unique to her species. They were sensing humanity's inner voice. Every human being carried on a constant internal monologue throughout their waking hours. They narrated their experiences to themselves, replayed conversations, planned future actions, argued with themselves about decisions, and maintained an endless stream of conscious thought. It was so natural that humans rarely even noticed they were doing it, but to telepathic aliens who were used to shared consciousness and harmony, it must sound like madness. Lyrillith, Sarah said slowly, what you're sensing isn't singing. It's how human minds work. We think in words and we talk to ourselves inside our heads. It's normal for us. The Zephyrian's form flickered with what Sarah now recognized as alarm. You speak of this as if it is natural, but no other species in the Concord possesses such chaos in their minds. The Altarian crystal singers think in pure musical concepts. The Vegan philosophers contemplate in mathematical equations. The Andromedan hive minds share singular thoughts across thousands of individuals. But humans appear to be constantly arguing with entities that do not exist. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was witnessing the collapse of humanity's chances for galactic acceptance. To species that thought in concepts, images, or shared consciousness, the human inner voice must seem like a form of mental illness. How could she possibly explain that this wasn't insanity, but actually one of humanity's greatest strengths? It's not arguing with entities that don't exist, Sarah said desperately. It's how we process information, how we solve problems, how we make decisions. The voice in our heads is our own voice, not someone else's. Lyrillith moved even closer, and Sarah could see her reflection multiplied in the faceted surface of the alien's crystalline skin. Commander Chen, I must tell you something that will determine the fate of your species. The Council has been monitoring your delegation since your arrival. Our telepathic abilities allow us to sense the surface thoughts and emotional states of other beings. But with humans, we experience something we have never encountered before. Sarah waited, dreading what she was about to hear. Every member of your team maintains constant mental activity that appears to be conversations with unseen individuals. Your linguist, Dr. Martinez, spends hours each day apparently discussing grammar structures with invisible teachers. Your cultural specialist, Professor Kim, seems to be constantly debating the meaning of our customs with phantom advisors. Even you, Commander, appear to rehearse speeches and arguments with imaginary opponents. The full scope of the disaster began to dawn on Sarah. Everything the human delegation had done to appear professional and competent had been undermined by something they couldn't control and hadn't even known was visible to their hosts. The Council has concluded, Lyrillith continued, that humanity suffers from a species-wide psychological disorder that makes your people unstable and potentially dangerous. The constant presence of these mental voices suggests a form of collective madness that could pose a threat to other telepathic species if allowed to spread. Sarah felt the weight of her species' future crushing down on her. Lyrelith, please. You have to understand. This isn't madness. This is just how human consciousness works. We don't have invisible companions or phantom advisors. We're thinking through problems, considering different perspectives, preparing for challenges. It's a sign of intelligence, not insanity. But even as she spoke, Sarah could see that her explanation was falling on deaf ears. How could she make a species that had evolved perfect telepathic harmony understand that chaos and internal conflict could actually be beneficial? Lyrelith's light patterns shifted to something that Sarah's cultural training told her indicated deep sadness. I have grown fond of your species during our time together, Commander. Your art, your literature, your capacity for individual expression, these things fascinate me in ways I cannot fully explain. But the Council fears that allowing humans into the Conquered would be like inviting a plague of mental instability into our peaceful alliance. Sarah's mind raced, her inner voice working frantically to find a solution to this impossible problem. Ironically, the very thing that was damning humanity was also working overtime to save it. She was considering dozens of different approaches, weighing options, discarding ideas and formulating new strategies all at once. What can we do? Sarah asked. Is there any way to prove that we're not insane? Any test or demonstration that could show the Council that our inner voices are actually a strength rather than a weakness? Lyrelith was quiet for a long moment, her inner light pulsing in slow, thoughtful rhythms. When she finally spoke, her words carried a mixture of hope and fear that made Sarah's heart race even faster. There is one possibility, but it has never been attempted with an alien species. Our people have a ritual called the mind meld of understanding, where two individuals join their consciousness temporarily to share thoughts and experiences directly. If you were willing to undergo this process with me, I could experience your inner voice firsthand and determine whether it truly represents madness or something else entirely. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Has any non-Zephyrian ever attempted this mind meld? No, Lyrelith admitted, and our medical specialists believe that the alien neural patterns could cause permanent damage to both participants. The risk is enormous. Sarah looked toward the shuttle bay where her team was waiting, then back at Lyrelith. The choice was impossible but clear. She could leave now and let humanity be marked as a species of lunatics unfit for galactic society, or she could risk her sanity and possibly her life for the chance to prove that the human inner voice was not a curse but a gift. If I agree to this mind meld, Sarah said, and if something goes wrong, will you at least tell the Council that we tried, that humans were willing to risk everything to prove we're not the monsters you think we are? Lyrelith's crystalline form seemed to shimmer with emotion. Commander Chen, if you are willing to undergo the mind meld of understanding, I will ensure that your courage is remembered regardless of the outcome. But you must understand that no one knows what will happen when a human consciousness encounters Zephyrian telepathy directly. Sarah took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. Then let's find out. Sarah followed Lyrelith through the winding corridors of the Crystal Palace, her footsteps echoing strangely off the translucent walls. Every step took her further from the shuttle bay where her team waited, further from safety, and closer to a procedure that no human had ever attempted. Her inner voice was working overtime, running through every possible scenario, every potential outcome, every reason why this was either the best or worst decision of her life. They descended deeper into the palace than Sarah had ever been before, past chambers filled with growing crystals and rooms where soft musical tones created complex harmonies that seemed to hang in the air like visible things. Finally, they reached a circular chamber deep underground, its walls made of pure white crystal that glowed with its own inner light. This is the chamber of shared consciousness, Lyrelith explained, her musical tones carrying an undertone of reverence. Here, our people have performed the mind meld of understanding for thousands of years. It is where we resolve conflicts that cannot be settled through normal telepathic communication. The chamber was empty except for two crystalline formations that rose from the floor like chairs carved from diamond. Between them, a pool of liquid silver reflected the light from the walls, creating dancing patterns that hurt Sarah's eyes to look at directly. Before we begin, Lyrillith said, I must warn you once more of the dangers. When our minds connect, you will experience consciousness as my people do. The harmony, the shared thoughts, the complete understanding of another being's inner self. But I will also experience your chaotic inner voice without any protection. If your mind truly is suffering from the madness we suspect, the feedback could destroy us both. Sarah nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. And if we survive? If you discover that our inner voice isn't madness, then I will take that knowledge to the Council, and perhaps humanity will have a chance to prove itself worthy of joining the galactic community. Sarah sat down on one of the crystal formations, surprised by how perfectly it molded itself to her human anatomy. The surface was warm and seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. Lyrillith took her place on the opposite formation, and immediately the chamber filled with a low, harmonic tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Close your eyes and try to quiet your thoughts, Lyrillith instructed. Let your mind become as still as possible. But Sarah quickly discovered that quieting her thoughts was nearly impossible. The more she tried to stop her inner voice, the louder it became. Her mind raced with observations about the chamber, worries about the procedure, memories of similar situations from her past, plans for what to say to the Council if she survived, and a dozen other streams of consciousness that seemed to multiply, the harder she tried to control them. Lyrillith began to sing, a complex melody that Sarah felt rather than heard. The notes seemed to penetrate directly into her brain, bypassing her ears entirely. The sensation was overwhelming, like being immersed in music that had become a living thing. Then the connection began. Sarah felt Lyrillith's consciousness touching, the edges of her mind like gentle fingers exploring the surface of an alien artifact. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was intimate beyond description, as if someone was reading not just her thoughts but the very essence of who she was as a person. At first, Lyrillith's mental touch was cautious, exploring the chaotic landscape of Sarah's consciousness with the careful movements of someone entering a dangerous place. Sarah could feel the alien's shock at the sheer volume of mental activity that was constantly occurring in the human mind. But as the connection deepened, something unexpected happened. Instead of recoiling from the chaos, Lyrillith began to understand it. She experienced Sarah's inner voice not as meaningless noise, but as a sophisticated system of mental processing that allowed for rapid adaptation, creative problem-solving, and emotional regulation. Sarah felt Lyrillith's amazement as the Zephyrian discovered how humans use their internal monologue to work through complex problems. When faced with a difficult decision, humans didn't just choose instinctively. They argued with themselves, considered multiple perspectives, weighed pros and cons, and literally debated their way to the best solution. It was like having a council of advisors inside their heads, all of them experts in being human. The mind meld went deeper, and Lyrillith began to access Sarah's memories. She experienced Sarah's childhood, watching through human eyes as a young girl learned to read by sounding. Outwards in her head, she felt the comfort Sarah had found as a teenager by talking herself through difficult social situations, rehearsing conversations before they happened, and processing emotional trauma by discussing it with her inner voice. Lyrillith experienced Sarah's military training, where the ability to maintain constant mental communication with herself had been crucial for survival in dangerous situations. Sarah could assess threats, plan responses, and maintain morale all simultaneously through her internal dialogue. What had looked like madness to the Zephyrians was actually a form of mental multitasking that gave humans enormous advantages in complex or dangerous situations. But the mind meld revealed something even more profound. Lyrillith began to understand that the human inner voice wasn't just about thinking, it was about hope. When humans faced impossible odds, they could literally talk themselves into believing that survival was possible. They could maintain optimism in the face of certain defeat by telling themselves stories about better outcomes. They could overcome fear, despair, and pain by engaging in constant dialogue with the part of themselves that refused to give up. Sarah felt Lyrillith's wonder as the alien experienced human resilience firsthand. Through their shared consciousness, Lyrillith saw memory after memory of humans who had survived impossible situations, not through superior technology or physical strength, but through the simple refusal to stop thinking, planning, and hoping. The inner voice that the Zephyrians had interpreted as madness was actually humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage. Then the mind meld went too deep. Sarah suddenly found herself experiencing Lyrillith's memories, seeing the universe through Zephyrian consciousness. She felt what it was like to live in perfect harmony with others, where thoughts and emotions were shared freely and conflicts dissolved in mutual understanding. It was beautiful beyond description, like being part of a cosmic symphony where every note was perfectly in tune. But Sarah also felt Lyrillith's fear, the Zephyrian's terror at the thought of losing the harmony that defined her species, of becoming isolated inside her own mind like humans were. To Lyrillith, the human condition seemed like a form of eternal loneliness, each person trapped inside their own skull with only their inner voice for company. Sarah tried to show Lyrillith that humans weren't lonely, that they formed connections with others precisely because they maintained their individuality. Human love, friendship, and cooperation were all the more precious because they were choices made by independent minds, not the inevitable result of shared consciousness. The exchange of experiences accelerated, and Sarah began to understand the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a mind meld between two individuals. Through her connection to Lyrillith, Sarah was somehow touching the greater Zephyrian consciousness that linked their entire species. And through that network, other Zephyrians were beginning to experience echoes of human thought patterns. Across the planet, Zephyrians who had never encountered a human were suddenly aware of a new kind of consciousness. Some began to experience, for the first time in their species' history, the sensation of private thoughts that belonged to them alone. Others felt the stirrings of internal dialogue, the ability to hold conversations with themselves about their experiences and emotions. Sarah felt Lyrillith's panic as the alien realized what was happening. The human way of thinking wasn't contained to Sarah's mind. It was spreading through the telepathic network that connected all Zephyrians, like a virus of consciousness that was fundamentally altering how they experienced reality. But even as fear flooded through their shared connection, Sarah also felt something else from Lyrillith. Wonder, excitement, the thrilling discovery that consciousness could exist in forms they had never imagined. The Zephyrians who were experiencing human style, inner voices weren't going mad. They were becoming more creative, more individually capable, more able to think outside the perfect harmony that had defined their species for millennia. The mind meld reached a crescendo of shared experience, and Sarah felt as if she was drowning. In an ocean of consciousness that contained both human chaos and Zephyrian harmony, the sensation was overwhelming, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. Then suddenly alarms began to sound throughout the Crystal Palace. Emergency harmonics filled the air as Zephyrian security forces mobilized in response to what their sensors were detecting as a mental contamination spreading across their homeworld. Sarah opened her eyes to find Lyrillith staring at her with a mixture of awe and terror. "What have we done?" the Zephyrian whispered. The emergency alarms grew louder as crystalline guards rushed through the corridors above them. Sarah could feel the vibrations through the chamber floor as hundreds of Zephyrians moved with urgent purpose throughout the palace. The harmonious tones that normally filled the air were replaced by discordant notes of panic and confusion. Lyrillith struggled to stand, her crystalline form flickering with unstable light patterns. The mind meld had affected her more deeply than either of them had expected. When she tried to speak, her musical tones were broken and uncertain, like a symphony with missing instruments. The connection. It went too far, Lyrillith managed to say. Your consciousness somehow traveled through our telepathic network. Other members of my species are experiencing human thought patterns for the first time in our history. Sarah pushed herself up from the crystal formation, her head spinning from the intensity of their shared experience. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Maybe this is exactly what needed to happen. But before Lyrillith could respond, the chamber doors burst open and a squad of Zephyrian guards entered. Their forms were larger and more angular than the civilian Sarah had met, with crystal formations that looked like natural armor. Behind them came Council Leader Meridian, his inner light pulsing with patterns that Sarah's translator interpreted as fury mixed with fear. "Lyrolith of the Third Harmony, you have committed an act of unprecedented recklessness," Meridian's musical voice boomed through the chamber. "The human contamination is spreading across our world. Already, 17 individuals in the capital city alone have reported experiencing chaotic internal voices. Our physicians believe this mental virus could destroy the foundation of our civilization." Sarah stepped forward, trying to project diplomatic calm despite her racing heart. "Council Leader, what you call contamination might actually be evolution. The individuals experiencing these new thought patterns aren't being harmed. They're discovering new ways to think and create." Meridian's attention turned to Sarah with an intensity that made her feel like she was being examined under a microscope. "Human, your species has brought chaos to our ordered world. The affected individuals are no longer able to participate in our telepathic harmony. They have become isolated, cut off from the shared consciousness that defines our society. This is exactly the kind of madness we feared would spread if we allowed contact with your kind." But even as Meridian spoke, Sarah could hear something different in the background harmonics that filled the chamber. Mixed in with the traditional Zephyrian tones were new sounds, discordant notes that seemed to carry individual voices rather than the collective harmony she had grown accustomed to. Some of the affected Zephyrians were apparently nearby, and they were trying to communicate in ways their species had never used before. Lyrolith moved between Sarah and the council leader, her form still unsteady but her voice gaining strength. "Meridian, I have experienced human consciousness directly. What we interpreted as madness is actually a sophisticated form of mental processing that gives humans remarkable adaptability and creativity. The individuals who are experiencing these new thought patterns are not being harmed. They are being enhanced." Enhanced? Meridian's light patterns shifted to what Sarah recognized as disbelief mixed with horror. "They can no longer contribute to our collective decision-making processes. They think in isolation, pursuing individual goals instead of working for the harmony of all. This is not enhancement, Lyrolith. This is the destruction of everything we are as a species." The sound of running footsteps echoed from the corridors outside, and more Zephyrians began entering the chamber. But these newcomers were different from the guards and council members. Their light patterns were chaotic, flickering with the same kind of irregular rhythms that Sarah had noticed in Lyrolith after their mind meld. These were the affected individuals, the ones who had somehow caught the virus of human consciousness. One of them stepped forward, a young Zephyrian, whose crystalline form seemed to shimmer with newfound energy. When she spoke, her voice carried individual inflection that was unlike anything Sarah had heard from the species before. "Council Leader," the young Zephyrian said, "I am crystalline of the Seventh Harmony, though I find myself questioning what harmony truly means. Since experiencing these new thought patterns, I have discovered ideas and perspectives that never occurred to me when my mind was linked to the collective. I have created music that comes from my individual experience rather than our shared consciousness. I have solved problems by arguing with myself, considering multiple viewpoints simultaneously. This is not madness, Meridian. This is freedom." More affected Zephyrians entered the chamber, each adding their individual voice to what was becoming a choir of unprecedented diversity. Sarah watched in amazement as these beings, who had lived their entire lives in perfect telepathic harmony, began to express ideas and emotions that were uniquely their own. "We are not sick," another affected Zephyrian declared. "We have not lost our ability to connect with others. We have gained the ability to choose when and how we connect. We can still sense emotions and share thoughts, but now we can also keep private thoughts, process experiences individually, and contribute unique perspectives to our collective understanding." Meridian's light patterns grew increasingly agitated as more affected individuals spoke. "You have been isolated from the greater consciousness. You think you are gaining something, but you are actually losing the connection that makes us who we are as a species. This human influence must be stopped before it spreads further. But Sarah was beginning to understand that something much more significant was happening here than a simple case of mental contamination. The affected Zephyrians weren't losing their telepathic abilities. They were learning to use them in new ways, combining their natural capacity for shared consciousness with the human ability to think independently. One of the older affected Zephyrians, whose crystal form was marked with the deep facets that indicated advanced age, spoke with a voice that carried both wisdom and wonder. "Meridian, I have lived for 3,000 of your years in perfect harmony with our people, but in the past few hours, since experiencing this new form of consciousness, I have had more original thoughts than in all my previous existence. I have questioned assumptions I never knew I was making. I have imagined possibilities that our collective consciousness would never have considered because they required individual perspective to conceive." Sarah felt a growing sense of hope as she watched the affected Zephyrians defend their new way of thinking. But her optimism was quickly dampened as she noticed the guards moving into position around the chamber. Meridian's light patterns had shifted to what she now recognized as the Zephyrian equivalent of grim determination. "This contamination ends now," Meridian announced. "The affected individuals will be isolated and treated until they can be restored to proper mental harmony. The human delegation will be destroyed to prevent further spread of this mental virus. Our civilization cannot survive if individual chaos replaces collective order." The guards began to advance, their crystalline forms glowing with energy patterns that Sarah's cultural briefings had never described. She realized with growing alarm that the Zephyrians possessed defensive capabilities that had never been mentioned during their diplomatic exchanges. Lyrelith stepped in front of Sarah, her own form beginning to glow with similar energy patterns. "Meridian, you cannot destroy what you do not understand. These humans have given us a gift that could transform our entire species. Individual consciousness does not replace collective harmony. It enhances it by adding the perspective of unique minds choosing to work together rather than being compelled to think alike." The chamber filled with tension as the traditional Zephyrians faced off against their affected brethren. Sarah found herself at the center of what was rapidly becoming the first conflict in Zephyrian history. A civil war between those who cherished their ancient harmony and those who were discovering the power of individual thought. As energy began to build in the crystalline weapons of both sides, Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of humanity's application to join the galactic concord, but the entire future of Zephyrian civilization. The question was no longer whether humans would be accepted as equals among the stars, but whether the gift of individual consciousness would survive to transform the galaxy, or be destroyed by those too afraid to embrace change. The energy in the chamber reached a dangerous peak, as both sides prepared for a conflict that had never occurred in Zephyrian history. The crystalline weapons of the guards hummed with power, while the affected Zephyrians began to glow with their own defensive capabilities. Sarah stood in the center of it all, knowing that she was about to witness the first war on a planet that had known only peace for millions of years. But instead of running or trying to hide behind the nearest crystal formation, Sarah did something that surprised everyone in the chamber, including herself. She stepped forward into the space between the two opposing groups and began to speak, not to either side specifically, but to all of them at once. "Council Leader Meridian, Lyrelith, all of you," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite the energy crackling in the air around them. "I want to tell you something about what it means to be human. Something that your telepathic abilities have let you observe but perhaps not fully understand." The weapons remained charged, but something in Sarah's tone made both sides pause. She could feel dozens of alien minds focused on her, waiting to hear what she had to say that could possibly matter in the face of their fundamental disagreement about the nature of consciousness itself. "You've been sensing our inner voices, our constant internal conversations, and interpreting them as either madness or chaos," Sarah continued. "But what you haven't understood is that this inner voice isn't just how we think, it's how we choose. Every moment of every day, humans are making decisions about who they want to be and how they want to treat others. Our inner voice doesn't just process information. It processes values, ethics, and the constant question of what it means to do the right thing." Sarah turned to address Meridian directly. "You fear that individual consciousness will destroy your harmony, But harmony without choice isn't really harmony at all. It's just the absence of conflict. True harmony comes when different individuals choose to work together despite their differences, not when they're forced to think alike. Then she turned to the affected Zephyrians. And you've discovered something wonderful about having your own thoughts, but don't let that discovery make you forget the beauty of what your species has always had. Your ability to share consciousness and understand each other directly is a gift that humans can only dream of achieving. Crystalline, the young affected Zephyrian who had spoken earlier, stepped forward with a light pattern that seemed to pulse with newfound understanding. Commander Chen is right. We don't have to choose between individual thought and collective consciousness. We can have both. As if to demonstrate her point, Crystalline reached out telepathically to one of the traditional guards. But instead of trying to force a connection or share all of her thoughts, she offered only a specific memory: the experience of creating her first piece of individual music, the joy of expressing something that came from her unique perspective, while still being part of something larger. The guard's weapon flickered as he experienced Crystalline's memory. For the first time, he felt what it was like to have a thought that belonged to him alone, and instead of fear, he experienced wonder. The memory didn't isolate him from his fellow Zephyrians. Instead, it gave him something unique to contribute to their shared understanding. Lyrelith, still glowing with the after effects of her mind meld with Sarah, began to sing. But her song was unlike anything that had ever been heard on Zephyr Prime. It combined the traditional harmonies of her people with new melodies that could only come from individual experience. Other affected Zephyrians joined in, each adding their own unique voice to create something that was both collective and individual at the same time. The effect was immediate and profound. The traditional Zephyrians in the chamber began to understand that individual consciousness didn't have to mean the end of their shared harmony. Instead, it could mean the beginning of a richer, more complex form of unity where each voice contributed something special to the whole. One by one, the guards lowered their weapons. Even Meridian's hostile light patterns began to soften as he experienced the new form of harmony that was emerging in the chamber. It wasn't the perfect, uniform consciousness that his people had always known, but it was something deeper and more meaningful: the conscious choice of unique individuals to create beauty together. Sarah watched in amazement as what had started as a confrontation transformed into a celebration of consciousness itself. The affected Zephyrians weren't losing their telepathic abilities. They were learning to use them in ways that enhanced both individual creativity and collective cooperation. But the transformation wasn't limited to the chamber. Through the telepathic network that connected all Zephyrians, the new form of consciousness began to spread across the planet. Not as a virus or contamination, but as an invitation to experience thought and emotion in ways their species had never imagined possible. Sarah felt a gentle touch on her mind as Lyrelith established a limited, telepathic connection with her. Through their link, she could sense the wonder and gratitude of her alien friend, but also something more. She could feel the collective consciousness of the Zephyrian people as they grappled with this new way of being. And she realized that they weren't losing their identity as a species. They were discovering what their identity could become. Over the next several hours, as news of the transformation spread across Zephyr Prime, Sarah watched an entire civilization evolve before her eyes. The Zephyrians who embraced individual consciousness didn't become isolated or selfish. Instead, they became more creative, more adaptable, and more capable of contributing unique perspectives to their collective decision-making processes. The fears that had driven Meridian and the traditional council proved to be unfounded. Conflicts didn't increase. Crime didn't emerge. The social harmony that had defined Zephyrian civilization for millions of years remained intact, but it was enhanced by the addition of diverse viewpoints and individual creativity. When Sarah finally returned to her shuttle, she carried with her not just the promise of humanity's acceptance into the galactic Concord, but something far more significant. She carried the knowledge that consciousness itself was more flexible and adaptable than anyone had imagined. The formal ceremonies that followed were unlike anything in the history of galactic diplomacy. Instead of simply accepting humanity as a junior member of the Concord, The Zephyrians proposed something unprecedented, a new kind of alliance based on the sharing of consciousness technologies and techniques. Humans would teach other species about the power of individual thought, while telepathic races would share their abilities to create deeper understanding and cooperation. Lyreleth, now permanently changed by her experience with human consciousness, became the first Zephyrian ambassador to leave her homeworld in over 1,000 years. Her mission was to carry the gift of individual thought to other species in the galaxy, to show them that diversity of consciousness was not something to be feared, but something to be celebrated. As Sarah prepared for the journey back to Earth, Lyreleth approached her one final time. The Zephyrian's crystalline form now pulsed with light patterns that were uniquely her own, reflecting a personality that was both individual and connected to something larger. "Commander Chen," Lyreleth said, her musical tones carrying harmonics that no traditional Zephyrian could have produced. "I want to thank you for showing us that the voice in our minds isn't madness or chaos. It's the sound of consciousness learning to sing its own song while still being part of a greater symphony." Sarah smiled as she realized that the question that had frozen her heart with fear had become the key to unlocking a new era of galactic cooperation. Humanity's inner voice, the constant companion that every human took for granted, had proven to be not a weakness but a gift that could transform the entire galaxy. The universe was about to become a much more interesting place, filled with countless voices, each singing their own unique song while choosing to harmonize with others. And it had all started with a simple question that had terrified a human diplomat, but changed the course of galactic history. As Sarah's shuttle lifted off from Zephyr Prime, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the things that make us different are exactly the things the universe needs most.